Imagine a world where the most powerful weapon isn't a missile or a drone, but the collective vibration of human vocal cords hitting a perfect, haunting resonance. In the cynical age of 2026, where digital artifice dominates our senses, we often believe we've heard it all, until a group of unassuming men in tattered coats walked into the most prestigious cathedral in Europe and silenced the scoffers with a sound that seemed to tear the veil between heaven and earth. Before we dive into this incredible journey of the Siberian Resonance Choir, I want to know who is joining us today. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. This isn't just a story about music. It is a story of national pride, hidden genius, and the moment a group of mocked outcasts forced the global elite to face the raw power of the human spirit. Stay with us, because the climax of this performance contains a sonic phenomenon so rare that experts are still struggling to explain how it was physically possible without the use of electronic amplification. The story begins in the frost-bitten outskirts of Novosibirsk, where the wind doesn't just blow. It howls with a frequency that seems to seep into the very bones of its inhabitants. Here, a group of 15 men, mostly former coal miners and factory workers, gathered every Tuesday night in a basement that smelled of damp concrete and old sheet music. Led by Ivan Volkov, a disgraced former conservatoire conductor who had traded the glitz of Moscow for the solitude of the East, they called themselves the Echo of the Steppes. To the local villagers, they were a curiosity. To the modern music critics in the West who stumbled upon their grainy, low-quality YouTube uploads, they were a laughingstock. These early videos showed men with calloused hands and unkempt beards singing ancient Orthodox hymns with a rugged intensity that many mocked as primitive and unrefined. The comment sections were ruthless, filled with emojis of goats and jokes about singing bears, but Volkov and his men remained undeterred, practicing a specific lost technique of basso profondo that required years of physical conditioning. The mockery reached a fever pitch when a prominent British talent scout, looking for a gimmick for the International Sacred Music Festival in Paris, invited the choir as a joke. The invitation was framed as a celebration of folk eccentricity, and the media picked up the story with a heavy dose of irony. Headlines in major tabloids read, "The singing serfs are coming to the City of Light," and social media influencers made reaction videos, mocking their attire and their stoic, unsmiling faces. The choir arrived in Paris carrying their belongings in worn duffel bags, looking entirely out of place amidst the silk scarves and designer suits of the festival's patrons. They were assigned the final slot of the night at the Notre Dame des Champs, a slot usually reserved for the headliners, but rumors circulated that the organizers placed them there so the audience could leave early if the performance was as unbearable as the internet promised. Despite the sneers in the lobby, Volkov told his men only one thing: do not look at their faces, look at the architecture, for the stone does not lie. As the sun began to set over the Parisian skyline, the cathedral filled with a skeptical, hushed crowd, many of whom had only come to witness the train wreck they had seen teased online. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged incense, a stark contrast to the Siberian tundra these men called home. When the Echo of the Steppes finally walked onto the altar, the silence was not one of respect, but of amused anticipation. They didn't have a backing track, they didn't have microphones, and they didn't have the polished stage presence of the Viennese boys' choir that had performed an hour prior. Volkov stood in front of them, his back to the audience, his hands trembling slightly not from fear, but from the immense physical energy he was preparing to channel. He raised his arms, and for a full 30 seconds, he held the silence, forcing the audience to settle into a state of uncomfortable stillness. Then, with a sharp downward motion of his right hand, the first low note was struck, and the very foundation of the cathedral seemed to groan. It started as a low, subterranean hum, a frequency so deep it was felt in the solar plexus before it was heard by the ears. This was the octavist tradition, a style of singing where the bassists perform an octave below the standard bass line, reaching notes that technically shouldn't be achievable by the human throat. The scoffers in the front row, who had been whispering and checking their phones, suddenly went rigid. The sound didn't come from the men's mouths. It seemed to emanate from the floorboards, rising through the pews and vibrating the jewelry on the socialites' necks. It was a dark, rich, and terrifyingly beautiful sound that stripped away the irony of the modern world. The choir began the cherubic hymn, but it was unlike any version heard in the West. It was slow, glacial, and possessed a weight that felt like the movement of tectonic plates. The mockery died instantly, replaced by a primal, instinctive realization that they were witnessing something that defied the laws of modern vocal pedagogy. By the middle of the second movement, the atmosphere in the cathedral had shifted from skepticism to a form of collective trance. The echo of the steps began to utilize a technique known as overtone singing, where a single singer produces two distinct pitches simultaneously. As the high tenor soared into a crystalline melody that danced near the vaulted ceiling, the basso profundo singers anchored the piece with a foundation that sounded like a pipe organ made of flesh and blood. People in the audience began to weep, not out of sadness, but out of a sudden, overwhelming sense of insignificance in the face of such raw, unadorned power. The viral clip that would later dominate the internet captured a moment where a prominent critic, who had previously written a scathing article about the choir's lack of culture, was seen burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The music wasn't just being heard, it was performing a spiritual surgery on every person in that room, cutting through the layers of cynicism and pretension. The climax of the performance occurred during the 12 Robbers, a traditional Russian piece about repentance and the soul's journey. Volkov signaled for a crescendo that seemed physically impossible for 15 men to sustain. The volume grew not through shouting, but through the perfect synchronization of harmonics, creating a wall of sound that made the stained glass windows rattle in their lead frames. In this moment, the mocked singers were transformed into giants. Their ragged appearance no longer mattered. Their calloused hands were now symbols of the hard-won strength required to produce such a sound. The camera work in the viral video shows the light catching the sweat on their brows as they pushed their bodies to the absolute limit. When the final note was held, a low C that vibrated for nearly 20 seconds before fading into a whisper, the silence that followed was heavy and sacred. No one moved for nearly a minute, as if the audience was afraid that breathing would break the spell the Siberians had cast over the city of Paris. When the applause finally broke, it wasn't the polite clapping of a sophisticated audience. It was a roar of desperation, a standing ovation that lasted for 15 minutes. The very people who had joked about singing bears were now rushing the altar, trying to touch the sleeves of the men's coats. The echo of the steps had gone from internet memes to global icons in the span of a 60-minute set. That night, the video of the performance was uploaded, and by morning, it had garnered 10 million views, shattering the algorithms that usually favored upbeat pop music. Musicologists were forced to issue public apologies, and the choir was immediately booked for a world tour of every major cathedral in Europe and North America. The story of their triumph became a symbol of the triumph of the authentic, a reminder that true art doesn't need a high-budget marketing campaign or a polished aesthetic to resonate with the human soul. However, the fame didn't change the men from Novosibirsk. After the tour, they didn't buy mansions or move to Moscow. They returned to their basement in the frozen east, using their earnings to build a school for traditional vocal arts in their village. They proved that the mockery of the world is often just a mask for a deep-seated fear of something real and powerful. Today, the Cathedral performance remains one of the most watched musical events in digital history, serving as a permanent rebuke to anyone who judges a book by its cover, or a choir by its coat. The resonance they created that night in Paris didn't just stay within the stone walls of the church. It traveled through the fiber-optic cables of the world, reminding us all that there is a frequency of truth that can never be silenced. They were mocked for their simplicity, but in the end, it was their simplicity that saved the soul of the audience. As we reflect on the journey of Ivan Volkov and his men, we have to wonder how many other hidden gems are currently being overlooked because they don't fit the viral mold. The Siberian Resonance Choir taught us that the human voice is the original instrument, and when tuned to the frequency of sincerity, it can topple the tallest walls of arrogance. Their story is a testament to the fact that greatness often resides in the most unexpected places, waiting for the right moment to emerge and shock the world. If you ever feel like your voice isn't being heard, or if you feel mocked for your passions, remember the men from Novosibirsk who sang until the world had no choice but to listen. Their legacy isn't just in the notes they sang, but in the silence they commanded from a world that had forgotten how to be still. The technical mastery displayed that night has since been studied by vocal coaches globally, who are baffled by the lung capacity and laryngeal control of the older members of the choir. Some researchers suggest that the harsh Siberian climate and the physical labor of their previous lives had inadvertently trained their respiratory systems to operate at a level far beyond that of a professional singer who lived a comfortable life. This biological advantage, combined with their deep spiritual connection to the music, created a perfect storm of acoustic perfection. It highlights a fascinating intersection between environment, lifestyle, and art, where the struggle for survival actually provides the tools for the highest forms of creative expression. The singing serfs were, in reality, masters of a craft that the modern world had almost entirely lost to convenience and technology. The impact on the music industry was seismic, leading to a brief but intense revival of interest in traditional choral music and ancient vocal techniques. Labels that had previously focused only on synthesized beats began scouting rural villages across the globe, hoping to find the next echo of the steppes. But what they failed to realize was that the Siberian choir couldn't be manufactured or replicated in a studio. Their sound was the result of decades of shared hardship, communal identity, and a lack of ego, things that cannot be bought or produced by a record executive. The viral success of the choir was a glitch in the system that prioritized human connection over commercial viability, and for a brief moment, the entire world was tuned into the same frequency of awe. Looking back at the footage, there is a specific shot of the youngest member of the choir, a man barely 20 years old, whose face is illuminated by a stray beam of light hitting a stained glass window. The expression on his face is one of pure, unadulterated focus, a look of someone who is not performing for fame, but for the very survival of his heritage. This image became the thumbnail for the viral video, symbolizing the bridge between the old world and the new. It reminded the younger generation that there is something cool and rebellious about mastering a tradition that has survived for centuries, especially in a world that discards trends every 15 minutes. The choir became accidental influencers, showing that the ultimate flex is having a talent that requires no filters or editing to be breathtaking. The echo of the steppes eventually retired from public performance, choosing to leave the stage while they were at the peak of their powers. They left behind a digital footprint that continues to inspire millions of people every year. Their story is frequently used in documentaries about the power of the human spirit, and the Paris Cathedral where they perform now has a small plaque commemorating the night the stones sang. They proved that the skeptics are often the loudest before they are the most humbled. When we think of Russia now, many think of the harsh landscapes or the political turmoil, but millions more think of the men who walked into a cathedral in Paris and showed the world what it sounds like when a soul truly finds its voice. As we close this chapter of musical history, it's worth asking ourselves what vibrations we are putting out into the world. Are we joining the chorus of mockery, or are we searching for the deep, resonant truths that connect us all? The Siberian choir changed the world not by shouting over the noise, but by singing a frequency so pure that the noise had to stop to listen. This documentary was brought to you by a fascination with the stories that remind us of our shared humanity. If this story moved you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the viral moments that actually changed the world. Now, I have a question for you. Do you believe that modern music has lost its soul, or is it just waiting for its next Siberian moment? Let us know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.